So this talk is really three talks which hang together loosely. The first talk is a talk which is trying to find out what an environment is. And it's ontological in something like the traditional philosophical sense. The second part is showing how people, including me, are developing something called the Environment Ontology, or ENVO. And there I will explain what an ontology is in this more technical sense, part of ontological engineering, and why people think it's useful, and what it's useful for. So that's a rather practical presentation. And then the third part is really about cognitive science. And it connects with the other two parts, but in mysterious ways, which will become clear maybe at the very end. And if there's anything that you would like me to describe in more detail, if there's anything which you find confused or where you have urgent questions, then you should feel free to interrupt. And if I see faces or expressions of confusion, I may stop and force you to interrupt. So the basic idea is that, well, the background, first of all, the literature on environments is confused. So if you look at ecological literature, you will find various accounts of what environments are, which do not really add up to any single account. And I think part of the problem is that people run together different concerns about environments, concerns which I'm going to try and keep separate. And I'm going to start with a view of environments according to which environments are places in which organisms live. And then we have a question, what is a place? And the idea is that places are wholes. We're going to have to generalize what a whole is before we're done, but this is a starting point. Now, so I have some pictures of wholes. And so this is really the first example of a whole, which is also a place. And this is another example of a whole, which is a place. Now, of course, if you took the buildings away, you would still have a place, but you would no longer have a whole. Well, maybe you would have a hole. Maybe the hole would still be there. The idea then is that there are holes in reality. Holes are negative parts. They are parts of reality which you end up with if you take the holes with the W away. So a chair has positive parts, which are the parts you can see, and which parts you can stuff or saw or weigh, and then there are the negative parts which make it possible for you to use the chair to sit on. So very many kinds of entities have holes. These holes, with names, these holes play a functional role. They allow you to smoke or wear the pipe or the shoes, or to sit in the chair, or they allow you to live in the place. So this room is a hole. And this hole is a place where an organism could live. I'm not sure how long an organism could live in this room, probably for quite a long time. And there are probably colonies, I don't know how good the cleaning system is here, but there are probably colonies of small organisms actually living here. Bacteria, I imagine. So the idea is that environments in this first sense are wholes in the generalized sense, according to which even if you took the buildings around the St. Mark's Square in Venice away, you would still have a place and you would still have a whole. And so animals don't need to, or organisms don't need to live for very long in holes in order for these holes to be environments. It can be that the holes in question are important for the life of the organism only for a very temporary phase in that life of the organism. And there are some very complicated interactions between the different kinds of holes in which organisms make their lives. So, well, this is the malaria transmission cycle, which involves mosquitoes moving from one human to another human and infecting the human in such a way that the second human can be infected in an even more consequential way. The human being is the host for the insect. The insect makes its home inside the human being, and in the interior of the human being are environments in which the insect lives and in which the insect creates consequences for the human being, which are malaria. Now this is a list of terms in the study of environments, and this whole in the generalized sense is the account that I want to defend as a starting point for understanding what environments are. So when an insect is inside your body, or a parasite is inside your body, then the parasite is making its home inside an environment, inside your body, in the same kind of way that we are making our home inside this room, and in the same kind of way that you are each making your home in the chair that you're sitting in. Now, typically, there are going to be nested environments. So when you sit in the chair, then the environment that you create by sitting in the chair, which is borne by the room, is a part of the environment of the whole room. We are all sharing a common environment, which is the whole room. But if 2 or 3 of you in the back are chatting amongst yourselves, then you are creating a small sub-environment within that whole environment, which is the whole room. So we have to make it possible for environments to be nested. And we have to make it possible for environments to exist even when the organism which makes its home in that environment, or the population of organisms which makes its home in that environment, leaves the environment. And that's why I define an environment as a whole in this generalized sense in which an organism can live. Now, I'm going to use the term niche for the moment, although I will return to explain what the difference might be between a niche and an environment later on. I want to describe various different kinds of niches, and the kinds of niches are going to stretch all the way from niches which were present millions of years ago, when the earliest organisms were living in ponds, down to modern air-conditioned apartment buildings or university lecture theatres. And the idea is that as organisms evolved, so too did the environments, which they, to some degree at least, make for themselves. So there are old environments and there are new environments, and much of what we do actually in our lives is embellish the environments that we make as our homes. I need to plug myself in. So when we put paintings on the, if they are paintings, works of art, when we put works of art on the wall, or when we install plumbing, or when we furnish rooms, then what we're doing is embellishing. I guess there's probably a safer place for this. Yeah. We're embellishing our environments to make our environments more comfortable, but also more secure. And when we organize police services or armies, then we are also taking steps to make our environment more secure. So it's an interesting exercise to explore the degree to which what we do in our lives is in fact embellishing our environments, either on the inside or to defend it on the outside, or to secure it on the outside from rain and hurricanes and so forth. Now, these are some examples of types of niches, holes. The first example we've already seen, this room with all the doors closed. Or your mouth, when you close your mouth. When you open your mouth, then we have a case of number 2. When we open the door, we have a case of number 2. 2 is illustrated by the rabbit hole, of the kind that we saw earlier on, or by the mouth when it's open. 3 is illustrated by the surface of a leaf, and 4 is illustrated by the Klingon empire. That is to say, it's an area of space, 3-dimensional spatial volume, in which the Klingons live, and which is their territory. Now, the dotted lines here, I'm going to talk about to a certain degree, but there is a lot which needs to be said about the dotted lines. Let's take number 3, the surface of a leaf. Supposing that you have a mosquito on a leaf. The mosquito is on the leaf for a certain period of time. What is the niche or the environment of that mosquito? Well, we know what the floor of the environment is. It's the surface of the leaf. But what is the roof? How far does this environment extend? What we're dealing with here is something which is essentially vague. There is no truth of the matter. There is no line which we can draw, even though I drew a line. The fact that it's a dotted line is designed to draw attention to the fact that we're dealing here with a border which is not a physical discontinuity. And it's even more in the case of the Klingon Empire, because there are no walls around the Klingon Empire, it just fades away. Nowadays, borders between countries are very, very precise, but for most of human history, the borders were deserts or mountain ranges, and no one cared where the border precisely was, because no one would ever go into the desert. And so we're dealing here with something which is essentially vague, at least partly. The borders, the interior surfaces which bound this environment, which is this room, are precise. But the borders of the Klingon Empire are essentially vague. And this is a bit like the temporal border between being not bald and being bald. So one day, some of you will be bald, and it will be clear that you are bald. Now, most of you are not bald, and it's clear that you're not bald. But there will be a zone in time when it's not clear whether you are bald or not bald. Although things are not looking good. Now, similarly, when you are traversing the borders of the Klingon Empire, there will be a time when you are clearly within the Empire, and a time when you are clearly not within the Empire, but there'll be a period when it's not. There is no fact of the matter. So these are stationary niche types. These are mobile niche types. That is to say, they are niches which move around. So number 1 would be a womb, for example. When the pregnant woman is walking around, then there is a niche inside her body for the fetus or the embryo. And that niche is moving around. The interior of a snail's shell. So I should be very careful always to say the interior of. The cow case, you have to imagine that the cow is like the insect on the leaf. The cow is walking around the field, and as the cow walks around the field, then this border walks around with the cow. And then when the buzzard is flying around in the sky, it takes its niche with it, in this sense of niche. So this is a very generalized sense of whole. It's a whole without any physical, yes?
Isn't the mosquito example basically the same? Because
well, no, I was assuming that the mosquito was stationary on the leaf, but you're right. Except, no, it's not the same, because the leaf is not moving.
All the grass is moving.
No, but the the niche is moving.
So,
So
so for like 2 feet from outside of the cow, it says niche, and as he moves around,
something like that.
something like that.
So
So-
the mosquito hops over to another leaf.
Then it's exactly the same case. Yes, you're right. There are some puzzles here. So let's suppose you're in a railway carriage and you climb out the railway carriage and change trains. Then you're moving from one niche to another niche, and then as you move from one niche to the other niche, you're in a succession of niches as you walk across the platform. Maybe.
So, but like the Klingon territory, so you know when you're in it and you know when you're not in it. So there's a line there where you can say, I'm in it, now I'm not, and now I'm somewhere in it. There's a line though, right? So if you know you're not in the Klingon territory, then there's some sort of line where you're saying, okay, well, I could be. So the Klingon
Yeah, but that
borders
line where you could be is broad.
like
And it
so it's
doesn't
just- so
have
it's a broad-
boundaries.
Well, it's boundaries when you know you're not in it, and when you know you.
Yeah, but the
you are,
boundary.
right?
So we're dealing here with an infinite regress of vagueness.
Yeah.
So you know you're in the Klingon Empire, and then you begin to not be quite sure. So there's an area of being in it and an area of being not quite sure. Now let's suppose you're moving from the area of being in it and the area of not being quite sure.
Where's
Then
that?
there's an area of not being quite sure whether you're in the not quite sure.
Yeah, right? Okay, exactly, yeah.
So you can't.
So where's the
no
line?
way.
Yeah, well, how do you know? Okay.
All right, now, and then of course there are many topologically more complicated cases. So this is already topologically more complicated. This is a tunnel. And the interior of your gut is shaped like that. So it's starting with this border, and then there's another border at the other end. And you can have tubes which bifurcate. Now the interior of your gut is an environment for probably 10 to the 14th microorganisms, actually. And there are 200 times more genes in those microorganisms taken together than there are in you without them. So you are genetically 200 times more complicated than you thought. That's called a microbiome, the collection of microorganisms inside your body. And this is an illustration of some of the topological complexity that even the gut manifests. It's actually not really topologically very complicated. It really is just a tube. It just looks more complicated. But if you're interested in those topological complexities, there's a very nice book called Holes and Other Superficialities, which contains a study of holes in all their topological and indeed cognitive complexity, because one of the arguments that Casati and Bartzi make in this book is that holes are, from a cognitive point of view, very important. So we can see holes. We can fall into holes. Or down holes. So, if you look at the history of metaphysics or the history of ontology, you will find that the category of holes is a much neglected category. So Aristotle didn't talk about holes. He talks about places a little bit. But what he has to say about places is very narrow. Basically, a place is what you occupy when you are surrounded by a medium. So I'm now in a medium of air, and my place is the immediate surface of air around me. And if I was in water, then my place would be the immediate surface of the water. And only whole organisms or whole substances have a place, according to Aristotle. And Aristotle talks about qualities and he talks about processes, but he doesn't have very much to say about wholes. Kant doesn't have very much to say about wholes. Plato doesn't have very much to say about wholes, although Plato talks about caves, but from an epistemological, not an ontological point. So the ontology or the metaphysics of wholes is a neglected category. And similarly, the ontology of boundaries is neglected in the history of metaphysics. And we can understand wholes in the sense I described only if we understand boundaries. And then we need two kinds of boundaries. We need physical discontinuities, the boundary of this table or of the floor here, and we need what I call fiat boundaries, which are the boundaries which are marked by means of the dotted line, and which are, in very many cases, also vague. They don't have to be vague, but they are in many cases vague. So this is a whole. I mean, it's an example of a whole. It's a topologically very simple whole, and it has physical discontinuities here, and it has a fiat boundary here. And this is a hill, which again has a fiat boundary here, but now we have a fiat boundary which is in solid rock. Earlier we had a fiat boundary which was in air. But otherwise the two are remarkably similar. In fact, one could be used to fill the other. Now we're reaching the point where we can start to talk about how organisms live in holes or in environments. This is a bear in a cave. And we have here already a quite complicated structure from the point of view of hole theory. First of all, we have the cave interior itself, which is a hole in the cave and which has this structure that I just referred to. We have a physical discontinuity, and we have a fiat boundary. The physical discontinuity is a discontinuity between solid rock, in this case, and air, some medium. So we have what I call the retainer, which is the boundary of some structure, contains something. And we have the medium, which fills this hole created in the retainer. But then the bear comes into the cave and creates a second hole. A hole in the medium. So we have a double hole structure. We have a hole which is filled by a medium, and then a second hole in the medium, which is a hole in a hole. But if the bear leaves the cave, then the second hole disappears. So the medium immediately swallows up the space and removes the hole. So what is the retainer? This is the first kind of question. What is the surface which is the relevant surface for the niche of the bear in the cave? And the problem here is easy if it's a very clean cave with good cleaning facilities. It's kept spotless all the time. But what happens if piles of dirt and bones and food start, or dead animals start to accumulate? Then we have two options. We can say that the niche is occupied by the bear and some of these other things, dead rats. Or we can say that now the retainer is not the boundary of the solid rock, rather it's the boundary of the solid rock plus the rats and the bones and the other things. Now, this sounds like a trivial kind of question, but in fact, it's going to be a very interesting question all the time when we're dealing with environments, for instance, like this particular room. Well, I suppose I'm in this room, which in fact I am. What is the retainer for my environment now? Is it the surface of the walls and the windows and the blinds and the door? Or is it all of those things plus the surface of your skin and clothing and feet and so forth? So what is the shape of my boundary now? What is the shape of the boundary of my environment now? Now this is a bit like the problem of vagueness that we encountered earlier, but it's a different kind of problem. All right, we'll come back to this problem too. All right. So we have a problem about the retainer. We also have a problem about the medium. Actually, the medium problem is probably easier to get our minds around. So in this particular case, the medium it's a body of air. But the medium might be something else. The air may be polluted, but it may be a body of water. The cave may be filled with water. The medium may be nasal mucosa if you have bacteria of your nose. So the body contains many different kinds of medium for organisms to make their homes. The blood is a medium for many kinds of organisms. All right, so we have two types of boundary. We've seen this already. We have a double hole structure. And all of this together make up what I would like to call the geographic or spatial niche concept. The cave is a place. It's a geographic feature. It's part of our geographic reality. You can map it. But it's also a niche. It's a place where an organism can live. It's a particular place. Now that's one concept of niche, the geographic or spatial concept of niche. But there is also an ecological concept of niche. And the cave actually is, from an ecological point of view, probably not a good niche, because it's not a good place for a bear to make its habitat. From the ecological point of view, the niche is not a place, it's a function. Or rather, it's a complicated constellation of functions. So this sense, the functional sense of niche, is illustrated in a phrase like, John found his niche as a mid-level accounts manager in a small-town bank. Or to quote Elton, who is one of the classic authors in the ecology literature, the niche of an animal means its place, not in our geographic sense, but in the functional sense, its place in the biotic environment, its relation to food and enemies. When an ecologist says, there goes a badger, he should include in his thoughts some definite idea of the animal's place in the community to which it belongs, just as if he had said, there goes the vicar. Now, we'll come back to this later on. For the moment, it's important just to understand that there is the geographic niche concept and there is the ecological niche concept. And it's clear that animals live in geographic niches. You can't live in a function. You can't live in... So you can live in a bank, I suppose, but you can't live in the function that the small-town banker exercises. But still, this functional sense of niche is important, because it's this functional sense of niche which is going to determine what kinds of organisms can occupy given kinds of spatial niches. They have to be spatial niches which satisfy certain functional requirements. You have to be able to breathe the air, there has to be a supply of food, there has to be shelter, and there has to be the right kind of temperature, and so forth, as we shall see later on. So that's the end of part one. This is about the question, what is an environment? And now we're going to come to part two, which is about environment ontology. Now, I started my career as a philosopher. In 2006, I gave a talk to my colleagues, which was called Why I Am No Longer a Philosopher. And the reason why I am no longer a philosopher is because what I do now is not part of philosophy in the traditional sense. It's part of ontology in a much more practical sense, which has roots in philosophy, but which is really very, very remote from the kind of work that philosophers do. Although more philosophers should do this kind of work because it's important, and probably philosophers would be good at it, if you're lucky. So this new kind of ontology has exploded in many, many areas. In government administration, in economics, commerce, in library science, in linguistics, in many fields. But its most successful achievements are almost certainly in the area of biology, and they almost certainly have to do with the new kind of biology which was made possible as a result of the decoding of the human genome. So the problem which this decoding presented to biologists is that we now have huge amounts of very, very simple but very, very large bodies of data associated with biological phenomena, and namely sequence data. And we need to understand how to understand this sequence data in useful ways so that we can do things like understand what happens when tumors are formed in cancer patients, or what happens when a fetus is developing in a womb. And all of biology has been transformed as a result of the fact that the main focus is on the understanding of gene sequences. But if you look at this, you can't really do very much with it. You need to know something about it. Computers can't really do very much with it unless they know the answers to certain questions. So the computer needs to know, for instance, what part of the cell has this particular expression pattern, or what molecular function is being exercised, or what biological process is being contributed to, whether it's heart development in a fetus or brain damage in a shrimp. And the problem is that while there is a very, very precise way of capturing this molecular information, each biologist will give different kinds of answers to these questions using different terminologies. And in 1999 or thereabouts, a group of biologists from different organism communities, so they're human, mouse, yeast, fish, and so forth, got together and created a controlled vocabulary for giving answers to these questions. So that all biologists, whether they were working on the fly genome or the mouse genome or the human genome, would use the same terms to describe the parts of cells. And this controlled vocabulary was called the gene ontology, or GO. And GO provides a set of natural language labels which are designed to be used to annotate gene sequence information, or attributes of gene products, to be more precise. So proteins, in all organisms. So the gene ontology applies to all organisms of all species, to all biological processes, although in fact it's restricted to biological processes which you can think of as being natural. So it doesn't deal with disease processes, it doesn't deal with laboratory processes. And the idea is that the gene ontology will make this data, which is very difficult to understand, cognitively accessible to humans. And it will also make this data algorithmically tractable to computers, so that computers can reason about biology by reasoning about the sequences as annotated using the terms in the controlled vocabulary called the gene ontology. Now, the gene ontology just includes not only terms but also definitions, and there is a certain logical structure to the gene ontology. But really, it's a collection of natural language labels. And you can think of these natural language labels as being somewhat similar to what you have in a map when you have a map legend. So the map itself represents the instances, the places. The legend tells you what kinds of things those places are: churches, cathedrals, railway stations, so on. So the gene ontology is a set of legends for protein data. And it's organized as a hierarchy, actually 3 hierarchies. So you have the biological process hierarchy, and then you have a subtype relation. Every cellular process is a biological process. Every cell differentiation process is a cellular process. Every process of cell fate commitment is a cell differentiation process. And then you have a part of relation, which I can't quite read, but this is something like asymmetric protein localization involved in cell fate commitment is a part of cell fate commitment. And the core of the gene ontology just uses those two relations, subtype or ISA and part of. There are, in the current version of the gene ontology, more relations, but the core is captured just with those two. Now, there are something like 25,000 nodes in the gene ontology. And there is a whole industry of biocurators whose job is to go through experimental data produced by biologists and annotate that data using the gene ontology. And so there are many, many articles describing biological experiments which have been annotated in this way. And in the annotated data thereby becomes searchable, retrievable, and able to be used for reasoning of various sorts because of all this work of annotating the data using the gene ontology. So this is another part. So the behavior is a kind of biological process, feeding behavior is a kind of behavior, eating behavior is a kind of feeding behavior, and pharyngeal pumping is a kind of eating behavior. Now, the idea is that if you have many, many databases, including image databases and so forth, which have been annotated using the Go, then all of those data become linked together through the Go. So the Go is a kind of entry point. Somebody who's interested in sphingolipid transporter activity can find the data entries in thousands of different databases immediately on his screen, because all of those databases are using the gene ontology to describe their data. And you can move around the gene ontology in order to do your research. So the gene ontology has become a standard research tool for very many biologists, and increasingly also for people working in clinical medicine or in drug discovery, and so forth. So, what was a threatening problem in biology, which was the balkanization of data resulting from the successes of the Human Genome Project, has been prevented, at least to some degree, by the Go. But the Go is limited. It only covers three sorts of terms. Terms describing cellular components, terms describing molecular functions, and terms describing biological processes. So there are no disease terms in the Go. There are no symptoms, there are no protein interactions, there are no experimental processes. The Go is really rather limited. And so, along with other people, I have been working for the last years trying to extend the Go to cover the whole of life, the whole of biology. And we created something called the OVO Foundry. And this is the 13 original states of the OVO Foundry. The yellow part are the three trees of the Go, and then there are various other ontologies which are illustrated here. So we have anatomy ontologies, we have function ontologies, we have a phenotype ontology, we have a cell ontology, and so on. We have various chemistry ontologies. And each of these ontologies has been created using the same method as the Go to work with the Go, but also to work with each other, so that we can annotate not just the three kinds of features that the Go describes, but all features of life. But now, so these are the 13 original states. We're gradually trying to expand. So one area that still we do not have good ontologies for are population phenomena. So we don't have a good ontology of families, communities, populations, species, and so forth. And another thing we didn't have is a good ontology of environments. And so the problem arose, how can we build an environment ontology? And I can tell you that it goes here, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. So the Environment Ontology, or ENVO, was put together, so we do have a draft version of the Environment Ontology. It was put together by biologists, not by geographers, although it should have been geographers really who were working on it from the start. But now there are some people in geography who are trying to help us. I'm involved in the Environment Ontology. We have an ecologist involved in the Environment Ontology. The whole thing is run by the Genomic Standards Initiative. It has some communities who are interested in using it for reasons which I will explain. What I want to do first is to describe the background and some of the differences involved in building. So we talked about Elton. In fact, the more influential ecologist from the point of view of the functional theory is G.E. Hutchinson, who puts forward a hyper-volume theory of niches. So the idea is that, well, this is a better picture. The universe is a gigantic evolutionary hotel. And where normal hotels would have 3 dimensions, this gigantic evolutionary hotel has n dimensions, where the dimensions relate to things like food supply and temperature gradients and so forth. So each room in the hotel has an area within it which is an area of high fitness for certain organisms. Some organisms will live in those rooms, but some rooms will be empty because no organism can live in that room, because they're too cold or because there's no food or for whatever reason. So from the Hutchinsonian point of view, each niche is a room in this n-dimensional hotel. And the variables which make the dimensions of the hotel are things like exposure to sunlight, soil fertility, foliage density, salinity, radioactivity, and so on. Or turbidity, or available light, or predominant vegetation, predatory pressure, nutrient limitations. So the idea behind ENVO is to take the spatial account of niches that I described earlier and to ally it with a Hutchinsonian perspective so that we can actually capture the sense in which this room, for instance, can be an environment for multiple organisms which are addressing different areas of fitness within this n-dimensional constellation, the variable. So as I say, there are almost certainly corners of this room where bacteria are thriving. Probably under the table. So to do that is quite difficult, but here is the top level that we're working on. So I need to explain some of the technical terms here, but just look near the bottom because the bottom terms are going to be more recognizable. So we have ecosystems. Ecosystems include biomes, microbiomes. So the microbiome of your gut is a kind of biome, which is a kind of ecosystem, which is a kind of system. And then the terrestrial environment is a kind of environment, which is a kind of spatial region or site. So I'll come back to explain some of the other terms in a minute. And then once we have biome, terrestrial biome, we can go down and define other kinds of environment, which we are trying to do here. And we also need to define environmental feature. So we have mesoscopic physical object. A carcass is an environmental feature. A biofilter is a fossil is an environmental feature from this point of view, and so on. And all of these can be environments for organisms of specific sorts. We also are building, actually the progenitor, or the main progenitor of the gene ontology is building something called GAZ, which is an open source gazetteer based on ontological principles, which is designed to work with ENVO. Where ENVO describes the types of environments, GAZ is a gazetteer, which means that it gives you a catalogue of the actual places themselves. All right, so let's see how the top level looks. The ontologies that we've been building are based on something called BUFO, which stands for Basic Formal Ontology. This divides everything into 2 types. On the one hand, we have things which continue to exist, like things. this table, this hand. And then on the other hand, we have things which occur, processes. And organisms are things. And the Obo Foundry is organized according to Buffo. So we have processes here. Then we have two kinds of continuants. On the one hand, we have independent continuants, like organisms and cells and molecules, which means they are continuants which exist independently. And then we have dependent continuants, which are things like qualities and functions, which depend upon the independent continuants in the sense that every quality is a quality of something, for instance, an organism. And just to complete the picture, in this dimension we have the very small stuff here, and then we get larger as we move up. And then to say that environments go here is to say that environments are independent continuants which exist at every level. So there are molecular environments, there are cellular environments, there are environments of single organisms, and there are environments of populations of organisms. Now, one of the higher level terms in our EMBO is system, because we're interested in environmental systems. And this is the definition of system that I would like to defend. So a system is an independent continuant which is composed of interacting material entities which form an integrated whole. That is a system. That is a system. And now, environmental systems are things like that. And we define an environmental system as a system which includes an environment and organisms as components. And an environment is a region of space in which an organism can be contained, and an ecosystem is an environmental system that is self-contained. This is just a proposal, but it will give you some idea of what's involved in fixing the top level of the Environment Ontology. Then we define a biome as an ecosystem which contains populations adapted to the environmental conditions conserved over its spatial extent. And a microbiome is a biome which is made of the microscopic organisms in a given microbial environment inside an organism. And a habitat is an ecosystem which can support the life of a given organism, population, or community. So these are some examples, let's just go back to this, of some of the terms near the top here. And now let's very quickly look at how this thing is used, why it's needed. So there is something called Strain Info. Strain Info is a website where you can buy bacteria. And it contains access to collections of bacteria which are being maintained by various institutions throughout the world. Now, it would be nice to know where your bacteria came from. So this particular bacteria, or these particular bacteria, came from swimming pool water in Morocco. They're not very nice bacteria, I think. These are Staphylococcus aureus. These came from sputum in Morocco. You can buy these. These came from New York. That's all they tell us. Now, this is huge. Strain Info is a huge database, very important database, which is a very important access route to a very important collection of entities which are being bought and sold on a daily basis. But the way in which the origins of these samples is described is chaos. It's just natural language. It's whatever the person who collected the sample felt like saying on the day. And so one purpose of the Environment Ontology is to provide a control vocabulary for describing the environmental, or the environments from which samples were collected. Another purpose might be to describe the environments from which fossils or other kinds of museum artifacts were collected. Another kind of use of the Environment Ontology might be to describe where patients live. So if you want to do environmental studies of public health, then it's good to know where particular kinds of patients live. But at the moment, those descriptions are provided in free text. There is no standard way of describing environments, and the Environment Ontology is designed to fill that gap. All right, that's the end of part 2. Now, very quickly, I'm going to try and do part 3 in 5 minutes. So, there is a school of thought called ecological psychology. And ecological psychology, I believe, is the way to do psychology. So I am a big proponent of ecological psychology. I think that Husserl, actually, if he was doing his job properly, would also have been a big proponent of ecological psychology. But for one reason and another, from a certain point in his life, he didn't do his job properly. So, but in order to do ecological psychology properly, we need a good theory of environments, and that's the purpose of this final concluding section, because I want to bring the results of working on the Environment Ontology to bear on understanding what Gibson and Barker are trying to do with their ecological psychology. So Gibson is more famous than Barker. I will mention Barker only fleetingly, but I strongly recommend that if you're interested in Gibson, you read Barker. Barker is the missing ecological psychologist. To understand cognition, Gibson says, we need to study the moving, acting organism as it exists in its real-world environment. So if you want to do the psychology of perception, you should not study perceiving subjects in special laboratory settings where they are told to stay perfectly still and focus on spots of light. Rather, you should sit in a sports car driving at 120 miles an hour while Gibson is driving. And Gibson himself, one of his favorite theories is that retinal images are not very important for visual perception because you have a feel for the environment. And so he would drive at 120 miles an hour and talk to you. And he would know that he was going to crash because you would react. So at that point, he would turn your focus on the road. So for Gibson, the cognition, a theory of cognition has to be biologically based, which means it has to be based in the interaction between an organism and its environment. And what this means is that our different patterns of behavior and cognition are unified together in result of the fact that we're all living in the same environment. This is a key idea. All of our environments, all of my environments at different times and in different capacities, and all of our environments at different times and in different capacities, fit together because we're all living in the same physical reality. So the idea is that if we want to understand cognition, then we have to understand reality. So there's no way of understanding cognition just by studying cognition. You have to understand the whole show. Which means that the ontology of the environment, in the Gibsonian sense, has to be an anti-reductionistic philosophy in a strong sense, which I will return to in a minute. So for Gibson, environments are nested. The whole of reality is a complex hierarchy of internested levels of parts and subparts. So as trees are nested within forests, and forests are nested within special federal forest protection zones and so forth, everything that we do within nested environments, both in space and to some degree also in time. So this lecture is nested within a lecture series, which is nested within a curriculum, which is nested within a university. And where organisms of the pre-human sort are concerned primarily with natural environments, we are living in environments which include also man-made elements like buildings and streets, but also books, well, and the internet, and pianos and libraries and the internet, as well as natural things like waves and climatic features and light and sound and so forth. So our environments are incredibly rich. But we managed to navigate through them very successfully. And all of this implies that if we want to understand how we navigate through our environment, we need to start from something like this. This thing is attracted chemically to this thing. Never misses. There is no problem of how the mind of this thing, or the brain of this thing, finds the place where it needs to be at this particular time. There is no counterpart of the problem which philosophers like to worry about, which is the mind external reality problem. How do we, using our minds, come to be able to grasp external reality? That is not a problem, just as it's not a problem for the insect. Because the mind is, the idea that there is a mind which is contrasted with external reality is a mistake according to Gibson. We should abandon the idea that there is some kind of internal Cartesian theatre. This is the driving of the car again. When Gibson is driving the car, there is no internal mind process. There is just Gibson relating to reality through the steering wheel and through his environment, which includes you, the person he's talking to. The organism is located within a surrounding environment, and all of the perceptions and actions of the organism should be understood as occurring within the surrounding environment, and not in abstraction from the surrounding environment. So there are no sense data, there are no representations, there are no noemata in Husserl's sense. Rather, there is an organism and an environment, both of which are interlocked. There is a perceiving, acting organism whose perceptions and actions are already intertwined with the things and surfaces of the external environment. All of this is quotations from Gibson. So for Gibson, each type of organism is tuned in its perception to actions and objects on specific levels within a complex hierarchy of internested levels, which stretches all the way from tiny food items up to the World Wide Web. And when we're in one of these internested levels, then we fit into our niche or environment in the same kind of way that a hand fits into a glove. Because we evolved to fit into a niche like that. And because we evolved to fit, we react spontaneously. So if I see the bottle of water over here, I don't have to think about what I need to do in order to take a drink, because the bottle of water is telling me what to do. It's making me resonate. So, organisms are like tuning forks, who are tuned to resonate to multiple different kinds of environments which surround them. So we've been evolved to resonate automatically and directly to those quality regions in our niches which are relevant for survival. And perception is one important form of automatic resonation. Whether we're an insect or a human being, we are resonating to our environment constantly. Now, bacteria resonate only to chemical stimuli. Cognitive beings, like you and me, resonate to sensory stimuli, to speech, to linguistic records of various sorts, to pixels on computer screens. And now the problem is to describe a science of all of this. How can we do psychology if psychology rests upon a view of the psychological subject as being a part of a whole with a W, which includes both the organism and its environment? And the answer, he says, has to involve physics, mechanics, optics, acoustics, chemistry. Now, of course, it would have to involve internet science, library science, and people still read books. Ecological facts, which are facts of higher order that have never been made explicit by these sciences and have gone unrecognized. So psychology is waiting to be discovered. And this explains the reason why environments have been neglected, not just by philosophers, by metaphysicians and ontologists, but also by scientists. So this is just one quote from Barker, and then I'll finish. The conceptual incommensurability of phenomena, which is such an obstacle to the unification of the sciences, does not appear to trouble nature's units. That's you and me. Within the larger units, things and events from conceptually more and more alien sciences are incorporated and regulated. That's you and me regulating to each other as I speak and you listen. And so we're going to crack this problem, and we're doing it here. So we've now started to build a mental functioning ontology. And as you can see, this is part of a large multidisciplinary project, the goal of which is to do exactly what Barker and Gibson said needed to be done, by taking seriously the idea that it has to be done in a systematically multidisciplinary way from the very start. So that's the end.